We obviously were flooded on the Friday during the incidents in October. Around 500 properties in Chesterfield were flooded in 7 different locations. 5 of the locations were as a result of rivers bursting the banks, and 2 others were just sort of standing water and were smaller numbers. I think the scale of the flooding was extremely sudden, and the sort of damage that it did was very substantial. Of the 500 odd properties that were flooded, almost, I would say 96-97% of them were exactly the same areas that were flooded in 2007. They predominantly were flooded as a result of the River Rother and the River Hipper bursting the banks. The River Rother had actually had a fairly major flood remediation scheme that was installed at Wingworth in around 2019. So there was a real hope that these houses would now be protected in the events of floods. Many of the people received a text message from the Environment Agency saying that there was a risk of flooding, but they tell me they receive these the whole time. Basically every time it rains they get this message. So it's very much the boy who cried wolf, and none of them believed there was a serious threat of them receiving of them ending up being flooded. In the end, some of the people in the Tapton Terrace area received a phone call from the Environment Agency saying, we really believe there may be floods. And this phone call came through an hour and a half after they'd flooded. So, from their perspective, they were already 5 or 6 feet under, or 4 feet underwater in their properties. As people may be aware, tragically, one person on Tapton Terrace was killed and drowned effectively in her own front room. I think she had very substantial mobility problems and was unable to get out of there, and obviously there is a police and fire service inquiry into what happened in her case. In terms of the broader area, obviously there's a number of factors that people are concerned about. The first is, why has this happened again? Why were the steps that were taken inadequate? There's a need to investigate whether gates were opened, whether flood planes worked. I think everything I've heard so far suggests that simply the speed of rain that we had meant that it wasn't actually a case of this gate was opened or someone did something to cause the flooding. It was simply the amount of rainwater that we had in a very short period of time led to these properties being flooded. And in the majority of the cases, the water had left again by the following morning, but the damage was done very quickly. The 2 rivers that flooded are actually very small rivers, so unlike areas like York, a very substantial river running through them, and Cockermouth, which I've been to previously. We're talking about rivers less wide than this room, and so I guess whether that means the margin for error is less, I don't know, but obviously the damage was substantial. In terms of people's response, obviously there's a lot of concern about the number that weren't able to get insurance, or because this area was flooded in 2007, many of them weren't insured. And many of them had found that they were able to get insured but weren't able to get insurance for floods. And so there's a lot of people who basically lost the vast majority of their possessions. I think there's also real concern about the council. I have to say that the Chesterfield Borough Council, in comparison to 2007, responded much more visibly and much more fully, and we didn't have what we had in 2007, which was 3 or 4 weeks on, still huge amounts of sodden goods left on the streets and all this sort of thing. The streets actually were cleaned pretty quickly. The response from Derbyshire County Council immediately was positive. We had a sort of flood rescue centre set up in the leisure centre within sort of 6 hours of people being flooded. Around 35 people slept there on the first night. I went down there myself and was actually able to drive some people home who were able to get home, people weren't able to get out to them. So we were able to get some people home that night, and it was actually closed again by the Saturday night, so everyone by Saturday night had somewhere to sleep the second night. The council worked very hard to get people into temporary accommodation and so on. But I think in the longer term, it leaves big housing problems. So with lots of people who now can't live in their own properties, but don't have anywhere to be. The council haven't got the number of council houses needed. Private renters have quite often said, well, look, you know, we obviously can't charge you for this, but you can have to move out. So there's a lot of people that have been really struggling to find alternative accommodation. We've also set up, which I think is a really positive thing, the Chesterfield Flood Victims Appeal that I set up with the Lifehouse Church in Chesterfield. And we raised already in the month since the floods £85,000 locally, and that will all be provided to flood victims to support them with stocking their houses with furniture and white goods and all the things that have been lost downstairs. We've no idea at this stage how big the demand is going to be. We've written to everybody in the flood affected areas. But we're worried that some of them won't actually be aware of it because they've now moved out of those properties. But we've, over the course of the next week and a half, inviting everyone to apply to Chesterfield Flood Victims Appeal if they were uninsured and have lost things, and we attempt to replace everything we can. And I think finally, we have a Section 19 report going on now. It's very important that is transparent. I think we need to look at what happened on this day. We definitely need to look at the warnings. Clearly, there was an Environment Agency officer on local television the day before saying that people shouldn't expect to flood, and actually they did. And we heard the Secretary of State at the Select Committee saying, well, we're not as good at predicting floods from the east as from the west. Weather from the east as weather from the west, and that was why we were caught on the hop. But I think what we also need is a really sort of candid discussion about whether we are capable of protecting some of these areas from floods, because, you know, we had, as I say, in the case of the River Rother, we did have higher walls. If we look back at 2007, the river wall had been knocked over by the force of the water, and there was no scheme on the River Rother. Since then, that wall's been replaced. A new flood remediation scheme has been put in place, but actually the flood remediation scheme worked as far as we can see, but it meant they flooded maybe an hour later than they would have done. And in terms of the wall, that stood fast, but people got flooded from the opposite end of the street to the one that they got flooded by last time. And so, you know, simply erecting higher walls or erecting bigger basins isn't enough. And so I think in terms of investigating nature-based solutions, in terms of investigating what more we do upstream, and also investigating early warnings and, you know, flood preparedness are really key, because, you know, many people, as the river level got higher and higher, were contacting the council and saying, right, we need sandbags, and the council was saying, right, well, if you get here, you can have one. But they hadn't, you know, the council weren't in a position, obviously weren't expecting this, weren't in a position where everyone had sandbags ready. And so, and also we did have new flood doors on all of Alma Street and Hipper Street, the other areas in Brampton. But those flood doors were inadequate in the face of these floods, and those people still flooded. There were some people that said they had the flood door, but water was coming in via air bricks and things, and others who were saying that the flood door itself was not watertight. So, you know, I think there's a lot of investigation that needs to go on to that. So, obviously happy to take questions on any of that, Chair, but that is feedback from Chesterfield.
Thank you.